Okay. Can you hear me, Joe? How's that? Hear me? Okay. It's 7 o'clock, and and Danny rings the bell. There we go. Now it's officially 7 o'clock. All right. It's so good to see each one of you here tonight, and it's starting to get dark outside now on us. Tomorrow is the first day of autumn, and it's my birthday, June said, all day long, right? I'm so very thankful that I've arrived home safely this afternoon. Had a good few days out in Colorado. I preached this past Sunday evening at the Bear Valley congregation over on the west side of Denver, and their lectureship came to a conclusion on Sunday afternoon. It was a Wednesday through Sunday lectureship, and since Celicia and I left on Saturday, we only got to enjoy the lectures on Sunday, but there were 6 lectures on Sunday, so quite a number of sermons and presentations we were able to hear. But good brethren at Bear Valley, they have a school of preaching, the Bear Valley Bible Institute, and Neil Pollard is the local preacher, and Denny Petrillo is the director of the Institute, and both of those brethren have been on our lectures before. We have a warm kindred spirit with Bear Valley. And then Celicia and I had the opportunity of going out to Estes Park for a few days, and I'm telling you, it's starting to get nice out there. Went on into Rocky Mountain National Park for the day, and we kept climbing in elevation, and I noticed we started off down in Estes Park, it was about 72, and then it was 70, and then 66, and then 62, and Celicia says, how far down is this going to go, you know? Finally, I think when we reached the peak at midday, the highest elevation in that park, it was about 50. So not bad. I mean, very, really nice. And the aspen trees are just beautiful. So anyway, great little trip, but good to be home and good to be in Bible class tonight. We're studying from 1 Samuel, and Samuel is, at the moment, the key player in all of this. But that's about to change, because as we're going to notice in chapter 8, Israel desires something that's not going to please God, but He's going to let them have their desire. Sometimes God does that, right? Sometimes we warn our children, you don't need this, and this isn't good for you, and I don't appreciate you wanting this. And finally, after a while, you say, well, go ahead. You know, you're going to have it your way. Just go ahead. Sister Cates, I remember Brother Curtis one night was teaching a class, and Brother Cates was talking about that very idea. And he says, you know, you see a child climbing up a tree, get down from that tree. Oh, don't get down yet. We're all right. Get down from that tree. And finally, Brother Cates says, you just look up there and say, go ahead and break your neck, right? Just go ahead and do it if you're determined to do that. Well, the children of Israel were obstinate and stubborn. And that would not be the last time God's people could be accused of such, right? But as chapter 8 opens, we're about to see someone else come to the forefront. And it's not going to be the beloved Samuel. In fact, we're going to start reading about this man named Saul, the son of Kish. And it is interesting just how many times his name will appear in these books, because there's so much emphasis placed upon his reign and rule over Israel. So as we consider Samuel, we've noticed how his mother prayed for his conception and birth. We notice how she dedicated him to the Lord. And then all of a sudden you get to chapter 8 and Samuel is old now. All right? So not a lot is said about Samuel's judgeship there in Israel. Now, he was a prophet of God too. But the people want a king, don't they? And so they don't want the judges ruling over them. But God doesn't look at it from that perspective. God sees this as a rejection of His kingship. We better be very, very careful how we treat our God. And we better make sure that we demonstrate before our God our absolute trust in Him. Because God had already proven Himself. All the way back to Egypt, bringing the children of Israel out of Egypt, God had proven, if you're with me, I'll win your battles. Now there were times, such as when the Philistines took the ark, that the hearts of the children of Israel were not right with God, and they lost the battle. But when Samuel turned them back to God, then they were victorious, even against this arch enemy, the Philistines. But notice in the closing part of chapter 7, Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. It speaks there about this circuit that he was on, going from city to city to city to judge Israel. And then where did he live? According to verse 17, it was a place called Ramah. That's where his house was located. And from there, I'm not sure about my geography on that one. But we'll have to check that out. His return was to Ramah, for his house was there, the last verse says. He judged Israel from there, and he built an altar unto the Lord from there. And then he receives this news from the children of Israel and from the leaders among the people about their desire for a king. Now what's interesting is this. He had two sons. They're mentioned in the opening of chapter 8. And they are judges in Israel, but they're not following. They are not following Samuel, which means they're not following the Lord. And so it is that the leaders there in Israel come to Samuel, and they said, you know, you've gotten old, all right? Your days are numbered, and your sons, they don't walk in your ways. Now, that really sounds good on their part, doesn't it? You're old, and you're a good man, Samuel, but your sons, they don't walk in your ways. Well, they didn't. They particularly took bribes. They were fraudulent in their behavior. But we'll learn a little later that the reason they asked for a king to replace these sons of Samuel was not because of the fact that these sons were wicked men. There's another reason behind why they want a king. But they're approaching Samuel without being completely honest. Your sons don't walk in your ways. Therefore, appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. Appoint us a king. And this particular thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel. Now know this, whenever something is not right in the sight of God, a man of God will not like it either, right? Now keep that in mind. If something's not right in the sight of God, then a true man of God will not like it either. So Samuel is not going to compromise. Samuel is going to take this to the Lord. This isn't right. Because Samuel has been a leader in Israel, but who's the king? God is. God is. And so, here's what the Lord said to Samuel, and this is encouraging. The Lord says, He says, they've not rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me. I heard someone today in social media, a faithful and able gospel preacher, who was bemoaning that there are so many who identify themselves as Christians who really don't follow Christ. And I am sure that's true. And he was discouraged and disappointed, and I understand that. But I want to tell you something to all of you that are striving to be faithful. Don't let what others do get you down for this reason. God says it's not your fault. God says they're rejecting me. And so there's some comfort here in God's voice to Samuel. Didn't Jesus say things similarly to His disciples? If they reject you, Jesus said, no, they rejected me. So this just goes with serving Christ, doesn't it? Don't let the actions of others turn you away from your Lord. Don't you become guilty thinking it's all your fault that others are not following Christ. They have a will too, don't they? So here you have the sons of Samuel refusing to follow their father. Thus, they're not following the Lord. Here are the elders in Israel who are saying, well, you know, we need to do something because these boys don't follow in the footsteps of Samuel. Just because you see a problem doesn't mean that your answer is the right one. Now, there was a problem with those sons of Samuel. There's no doubt about it. But the way they wanted to handle that problem was not good. Okay? What comes about sometimes is pragmatism, right? The pragmatist says, whatever it is that works, then that's what you're supposed to do. But that may not be right in the sight of God. So it would have been a perfectly legitimate thing to say, what does God want us to do with these sons of Samuel being evil? And what would Samuel have done? Gone to God with it, wouldn't he? He would have taken it to the king, God. Who will judge in Israel after I'm gone? And so they said, well, we need a king. And they insert this phrase, like the nations around us. Okay? Now we're getting to see the true reason behind this. It's not so much that they are fearful about the sons of Samuel and what they might do in leading the people astray. They want a king like everybody else. You see, God's people generally, down through the years, are always the common folks. They don't have what it takes to attract others in the physical, fleshly sense, correct? We know religious groups all around us that are pretty good at being able to attract a whole lot of people. But it's not always in accordance with what is right. And so these people who belong to God are saying, hey, we want somebody else to rule over us. Isn't that the way God's interpreting it? And however God interprets it is right. And so the Lord says to Samuel, listen to the voice of the people. Now back in Deuteronomy, God already said this is what's going to happen. He had already said through Moses that one day they're going to desire a king. And now that time has come. So, you don't take God by surprise. God knew what was going to happen. And in this instance, God says, okay, go ahead. Have a king. But God also said this, if you have a king, here's what's going to happen. All right? God says, here's what's going to happen. He also says this, if you have a king, I'll appoint the king. You're not going to get to appoint him. So this shows God's love still for the children of Israel, right? He's not turned his back upon them even though he feels rejected. And God says, I'll tell you what, you're going to have your king, but you need to know something about this king. And so verses 10 and following, we hear what kind of king it's going to be. As typical, this is going to be a king who Samuel said, and he's speaking on behalf of the Lord, who will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. Many of them will do what? They'll die in battle, if this is what you want. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. And he'll take your daughters, and he'll make them cooks and bakers and things of that nature. He'll take the best of your fields. They'll belong to him then. So what's God saying? You'll have your king, and he's going to take everything from you. You see, you've got it the way you ought to want it right now. But here's what's going to happen. Now, here's what's sad. They could hear all this and say to Samuel, "No, then we don't want a king." But after they heard all of that, we don't care. We want a king. And regardless of the circumstances surrounding his elevation to the throne, regardless of the consequences, we still want this king. We don't care what he takes from us. All right? And so the people, according to verse 19, refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, there shall be a king over us." And now it's crystal clear as to why they want this king, that we may also be like the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Isn't that sad, really? That's right. That's exactly what happened. They chose a man over God. You see, when we go into battle from now on, we'll be able to see our king. Okay? Because no man hath seen God at any time, but is there plenty of evidence for him? Yes. Was there evidence that he'd won their battles? Yes. Was Samuel speaking on his behalf? Yes. But now they come to this point and say, we want to see a king. We want to be like those around us. And what does the Lord say? He says, you go ahead and get your king. Now, oftentimes, and God has made this clear in this chapter, what we think is going to bring us happiness is not going to bring us real happiness. Because God says, here's what's going to happen. And you're not going to like it. And isn't it true that even though we can be warned, that oftentimes we'll still say, that's all right. We'll go ahead and suffer the consequences. This is what we want. Now, this is very much like immature children and how they behave in the presence of parents sometimes, isn't it? Here's what I want, but you don't understand. That's not good for you. Yeah, but I want it. And are determined to go ahead and get it. Brother Washington? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good point. Mm-hmm. Right. You know, it kind of goes, what you're saying there, and I think is a very good point. The law of sowing and reaping. We know it's true. I mean, it's a law. And yet how often in every generation of down through time, people hear about the law of sowing and reaping. You reap what you sow, but it doesn't apply to us. Somehow we'll be able to break that law. That is, we'll be able to stop this continuing cycle, and that very well could be true here. Oh, which means they're really not listening, are they? Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm. Wayne, do you have your hand up? Mm-hmm. That's the parallel we see, isn't it? Yes. Mm-hmm. So what happens is you lose your identity, don't you? When you want to be like the nations round about you, or as Wayne just mentioned, in the spiritual sense today, God's people, the church, has Christ Jesus as the spiritual head. And when we listen to the words that come forth from those who will lead the church astray, it's almost identical, isn't it? And there are those who push that because we want to be like those round about us. But when we think that somehow going against God is going to bring us happiness, we're going to be disappointed, aren't we? And so it would be for the children of Israel. Now, let's notice how this man was chosen, this man Saul, and we find this in verse, or rather chapter 9. He's a Benjaminite. All right? Now that's the smallest of all tribes, isn't it? And so he's going to come from the tribe of Benjamin. There is a mighty man by the name of Kish, who's part of the tribe of Benjamin. The text says he's a mighty man of valor. He has a son named Saul. Now, here's another lesson we're going to learn because what looks like would be a good leader in the eyes of men may not always be so in the sight of God, right? Now, from the physical vantage point, does Saul look like a king? He does. I mean, head and shoulders above everybody else. And so if ever you looked upon someone and you said, that's the man, Saul. Based upon his physical appearance, it would be, sure, this is the one. And in fact, this is where God starts. Maybe in listening to what the people desired, God says, okay, I'll show you. You can have a king like the nations around you. Let's see how this works out for you. But I want to say this about Saul in his defense. We will see on down in future chapters that Saul's disposition and heart will change. But he really started as a very humble man. In fact, there's some qualities of humility we're going to see in Saul that really do stand out, that are impressive, that are worthy of emulation. Here's what's so impressive at the outset of Saul. While he looks like he'd be a king, he doesn't see himself that way. Wouldn't you rather elevate somebody who doesn't think he deserves a particular position than somebody who thinks he does? Saul's a humble man. He'll even say, I come from Benjamin. That sounds a lot like Gideon back in Judges. Gideon, when the angel said, thou mighty man of valor, he's like, me? A mighty man of valor? But he was. Now, this young man Saul, verse 2 of chapter 9, was a choice, handsome man. He was one who was very athletic in his build, it appears, taller than everybody else. Striking to see this one by the name of Saul. Now, doesn't that appeal to us, though? Don't we like the great athlete who also has a degree of humility about him? We like that. One may have all the athletic ability in the world, but if he knows it, that kind of turns us off, doesn't it? And after a few years, even after he's excelled in college and he finds himself in the NFL, let's say, for example, he usually won't make it, will he? Because he's so full of himself. But here is Saul who's going to have a difficulty accepting this. And so Saul is out looking for some donkeys that belong to his father. He can't find them. And in the process of time, Saul then desires to see the man of God, the prophet, who sometimes would be called a seer. A seer. What would a seer be able to do? See into the future, wouldn't he? So here is Samuel, the prophet in Israel. Saul comes to him and informs him in chapter 9 of what he's seeking. Now, God is behind all this, isn't he? Because God says to Samuel, I'm going to make sure you know who it is. We see God's providence working here, don't we? So God is bringing Samuel and Saul together. And there's no miracle here. It's just all happening in God's providence. Saul needs something from Samuel, and Samuel will be told this is the one. Now, in verse 15 of 1 Samuel 9, the day before Saul's coming, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel, saying, about this time tomorrow, I'll send you a man from the land of Benjamin. You shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel, and he will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. For I have regarded my people because their cry has come to me. Isn't that interesting? We've heard that language before, haven't we? That the cry of God's people have gone up to him. Remember in Egypt? It seems a little different, though, under the circumstances here. But what God's saying is this: I hear what they want. I hear their desire. He heard that desire down in Egypt. They wanted out of bondage. Now he is not approving this desire for a king, but he's going to honor it. And so he tells Samuel, who it's going to be, the one whom he needs to anoint to be king over the people. Now, does Saul, who's just out looking for his daddy's donkeys, does he understand all this? No. This is, how did this happen? I think is the attitude of Saul at this particular time. And so he and Samuel share a meal together, and then Samuel speaks to Saul and tells him that he has been especially chosen by the Lord. Now, in verse 10, or rather chapter 10, verse 1, Samuel took the flask of oil that he had brought with him and poured it on the head of Saul. He kissed him and said, "Has not the Lord anointed you a ruler over his inheritance? When you go from me today, then you'll find 2 men close to Rachel's tomb in the territory of Benjamin at Zelzah." And what will he find? Well, he's been looking for all along, the donkeys, all right? So he's going to find the donkeys. But he also, at the same time, is going to come to know that he has been chosen king over God's people. Now, in chapter 10, verse 8, Saul goes down to Gilgal, and Samuel comes there as well, and burnt offerings and sacrifice peace offerings are made, and then before all the people, Samuel is going to reveal who is to be the king. Now, it's interesting that when Saul gets back home, we find that he relays to his uncle what has happened. And Saul's uncle said to him and his servant, "Where'd you go?" And he said, "Well, we've been out looking for those donkeys for our father." And Saul's uncle said, "Well, when he found out they'd also gone to see Samuel, tell me what Samuel said." And it's interesting that all that Saul told him was this. Saul said, "He told us where to find the donkeys." Is that all that happened? Now, here is the reason we can say that he was a humble man. He has just found out what's going to happen. He's going to be anointed the king over all Israel. It's going to be a public ceremony. Things are about to change for Saul. And yet, he didn't reveal that. He didn't tell him about the matter of the kingdom, which Samuel had mentioned. Now, that'd be the first thing you'd tell, right? He's still so overwhelmed with this that he says nothing about it. Well, in Mizpah, verse 17, Samuel calls all the people together. And he says to the sons of Israel, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought Israel up from Egypt. I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the power of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you." Now, what is that? That's a reminder of what he's done for them. Are you surprised that God would say that? So it is whenever you think, here's what I want to do, and you know it's not approved by God, it might be the time to go back and what? Read all God's done up to this point. So God says, here's what I've done for you up to this point. Now, however, he says, today you have rejected your God, who has delivered you from all your calamities and your distresses. You said, set a king over us. Now, therefore, present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans. So, we go back to the father, son, children analogy. A good father will do everything he can to provide for his own, to fight battles for his children, bless them in any number of ways. And there are times when a child will say to his dad, "Dad, you're the very best," after getting something, right? And those of us who are dads, we know that won't last long, right? It won't last until the next request is brought about. And it may be that in your judgment as a parent, on that occasion, after having given so much, you then say no. You never want to do anything for me. I knew you'd say no. Looks like I could do this. Looks like I could have this. Everybody else has it. And I thought, well, no. What's God saying right now to the children of Israel? Here's all that I've done for you. And then you rejected me. You rejected me. So now you're going to get what you want. And we'll see how that works out for you. So really, when you think about this is not a celebration, is it? Not from God's vantage point. The people, I guess, have grown so callous that they don't really care. They just want to get what they're going to get. Lesson learned, right? And so Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and they're going to allow lots to fall upon the right one. The lot will fall upon the right one, and we know who it's going to be. Now, he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by his families, and during that time, Saul is taken from among them. Here's the other humble action taken by Saul. They can't find him. All right? Now, so far, what have we seen? We've seen Saul not believing what he's hearing. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. You surely aren't talking to the right one. Don't you like that attitude? Now, it's going to change. Oh, Saul's heart's going to change, sadly. But when we talk about true humility, here's Saul saying, me? Then later on we find that when he's asked, where have you been? Out looking for Dad's donkeys that are lost. That's what his uncle asked him, where have you been? Is that all that happened? But he didn't tell him the rest of it, did he? Oh, and by the way, guess who's going to be the next king of Israel? Yeah, right? He didn't say that. No, this is the right man, it seems, at the moment. And then when it's time to crown Saul, he's nowhere around. He's not here. Many of you here know my love and appreciation for George Bailey. And many of you heard him preach. And I've heard George Bailey talk about other preachers. He's high on my list. But when he talks about other preachers, it's like that. He said, I followed the great John Bannister out in Abilene years ago, and I knew I had my work cut out for me because everybody loved John Bannister. He was a great man. All I could say to those brethren was, help me to be as good a man as John Bannister. Is that the right approach? And yet I think about Brother Bailey, and and then Brother Bailey would talk about, VP blah, boy, that's a preacher right there. Wendell Winkler, he can preach. And I'm thinking, Brother Bailey, you're not too bad yourself, right? Brother Bailey, humble man, came to Fayette, Alabama many years ago. And this young lady right here, April Tomlin, was about 5 years old, and I was the preacher there in Fayette. And I saw Brother Bailey there in the Anthony's home. I was there having dinner. And he took that little girl up in his arms and just had a whole conversation with her while the rest of us talked, Great George Bailey. Freed Hardeman decided to honor him. And he said, no, I don't need, but they pressed him. And okay. When the whole thing was over, everybody's looking for Brother Bailey. We want to go shake his hand. They finally found Brother Bailey way back in the kitchen area with a custodian, and he was learning everything he could about that custodian. That seems to be Saul at the outset. Saul, you surely don't mean me. I'm just from the lowly tribe of Benjamin. Where have you been? Out looking for the donkeys. Anything else happened? Nothing's happened. It's time for Saul to be anointed king in front of all the people. Where is he? We don't know where he is. He's not here. And so we find that they find him hiding, and they take him and bring him out among the people. And he's taller than everybody else. Now, we've already said this about the children of Israel. What are they thinking? They're thinking completely like fleshly people think. They're thinking like the world. When he's brought out and they see that he is a handsome man, and he's got this athletic build and a little bit of a shyness about him, and he's head and shoulders over everybody else. Long live the King. This is the one. This is the one that we want. And so when he was put in the midst of the people, see the one the Lord has chosen. Surely there is no one like him among all the people. And the people shouted, long live the King. And so Samuel told the people the ordinances of the kingdom and wrote them in the book and placed it before the Lord. And Samuel sent all the people away, each one to his house. Saul went to his house at Gibeah, and the valiant men whose hearts God had touched went with him. But there will always be some who are holding back. They're not true men of God, but they don't like the King, right? And so here is going to be the beginning of problems for Saul. Certain men of Belial, worthless men, said, how can this one deliver us? Now, first of all, they're not satisfied with God delivering them, right? And then when Saul is presented, how can he do it? And so they despised him, didn't bring him any presents, but kept silent. And so some lessons we learn from this tonight as we close with chapter 10 is that, number one, God's people get in trouble when we want to be like the people round about us, okay? Keep that in mind. Likewise, we need to remember that when men won't hear the truth of God, it's not a rejection of you and me, it's a rejection of God and of His Son, Jesus Christ. What we think will bring us happiness oftentimes will bring us much unhappiness. This is going to be the beginning of the downfall of the nation of Israel. Oh, sure, there's going to be the United Kingdom through Saul and David and then Solomon, but all of this is just preparing us for Christ, isn't it? Because the people are going to be led astray. Who is the other great figure besides Samuel in these books we're studying? Obviously, it's David. And David, the man after God's own heart. And we will thrill as we see the closeness of David to God most of the time. But as you look down the stream of time, you're going to find God's people moving farther and farther and farther away from Him. The one who looks the part may not really be the best. We will find that Saul, though he looked like a king, as people think of kings, he's not going to be the one best suited. Because later on he's going to be replaced by whom? By David. And what's David? What will God say to Samuel about David? You're not going to recognize the one I've chosen until I point him out. Because you see, God says, here's where you're going to find that I'm different. God says, I don't look on the outward appearance. I look on the heart. All right? And we see all through these passages God's providence at work. So we're going to begin to notice what happens during the reign of Saul next week. Starts off pretty magnificent. Saul is, he honors Samuel. Saul is one who is going to follow in the steps of the Lord, but then something's going to happen. And it's an interesting story to see it unfold. And so we'll pick up there next week. Thank you. Can't please and you can't warn, right? Yeah, at the end of it. No, that's right. That's right. Even that didn't take